Our scripture today comes from the story in Joel chapter 2. Then afterward I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female slaves in those days I will pour out my spirit. And from the Gospel of Luke chapter 4. When the devil has finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and the report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. And then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up in 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, except Naaman, the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way.
And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So this morning we start the first of a 6-part series on living a creative life. And as Chris mentioned, one of the conversation partners that will at least be existing below the surface of this series is Cincinnati artist, musician, and Presbyterian minister Troy Bronsink, who wrote this very thoughtful book on living the creative life called Drawn In, a creative process for artists, activists, and Jesus followers. One of the many things I appreciate about Troy's work, besides the fact that as a minister he's about the best musician I've ever heard, is the fact that he clearly gets that the creative process, the essential creative process that you may talk about when you're talking about design theory and in creative enterprises in the modern world, there's actually a huge overlap between those very processes and what the ancient Christian sages and mystics and theologians and even Jesus himself spoke on. In fact, really, if God is truly our creator, it should make sense to us that creativity and the spiritual path go together. They are one and the same path. So as we explore this series, kind of stepping into 6 pieces of that creative process each Sunday, one each Sunday, it should not only help kind of enliven some creative spirit in your life, but also should connect you more deeply to your spiritual path, to hearing and discerning God's word and will for your own life. And boy, do we ever need that in the modern world, don't we? More creativity and deeper spirituality. I mean, when you consider how many shifts that we have been experiencing in our society, and not just in the last few years, but for many years now. I mean, it's pretty tremendous. I mean, really, the last 5 generations, particularly those who have been born into the developed Western world, have experienced more change and greater shifts on wide variety of levels than the previous 200 generations before us. And we've been required to be creative, to respond to all these shifts. And quite frankly, it could feel overwhelming at times, can't it? Ministers aren't immune from that sense of being overwhelmed now and again either. I spent 8 years at Princeton Theological Seminary learning a model for ministry as best as I possibly could, that as soon as I stepped into the ministry in 1995, I discovered half of which was already outdated by the time I hit the ground in Scottsdale, Arizona. Half of it completely obsolete. Stress, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, I ate that for breakfast every day. Yeah. But I'm no longer as stressed about those shifts taking place in our world as I was in 1995, even though, by all accounts, they seem to be becoming greater and coming at us more rapidly. And one of the reasons for that, besides the fact that I think that God isn't an imbecile and is actually involved in our world and may have something to provide some help to us, is that actually just that. Not all the changes that take place are bad. There are many good things that happen when things shift around. And in fact, if you look at the course of human history, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that whenever the Holy Spirit has really been working to raise the general awareness of people and shift it, those shifts sometimes are painful, and they always break us out of whatever box we have put ourselves and God within. So they always involve some sort of saying, you know what, this isn't working right now because you're now responding to something that's actually a better way of working. So not all shift is bad. Sometimes shift, even deep shift, is good. So, one of those changes, by the way, that I experienced in ministry is, I was taught, part of the model that I discovered was obsolete, was that you learned as a minister that society wants to know what you think about politics and economics and basically the headline news. They want to know what a minister thinks. They're turning to a minister for guidance. Consequently, in seminary, you're trained to hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other and be prepared to comment on any of that. That is a model that is so far obsolete, I would call it laughable if there weren't so many ministers still thinking that that's what congregations need or expect of them. But really, it doesn't work. I'll give you an example of how that doesn't work. Take one of the headline topics that's been with us quite intensely for the last several years, healthcare. Right? Certainly a hot-button issue. Reading the Bible, reading the paper, better comment, right? How many sermons have you heard in the last 500 years? 500 years. I did that at 9 o'clock, too. The last 5.5 years since I've been here, it really doesn't feel like 500, really. How many sermons in the last 5.5 years have you heard preached from this chancel on health care? Or how many times have you ever heard from my lips the word Obamacare even? I can tell you, you've heard the word Obamacare from my lips once, and it's because I just said it. Now, why, given the importance of that subject in society, why have you not heard me commenting on that? Well, it's not because I have no opinions on health care. In fact, I have some pretty strong opinions about health care. Half of you might even call them enlightened opinions. The other half might call them ridiculous opinions. But I'm not refraining from saying anything because I'm afraid of you who might just happen to be in the other half. I can't recall a time where I've shirked an issue just because it might be controversial. No, it's not because I'm afraid of half of our congregation. It's because I'm afraid of me. Or more precisely, I don't trust whatever idea I might have about what will fix our healthcare system. As a layperson with respect to healthcare, who has had no training, whose occupation is not healthcare, I have my ideas of what might work, but I also recognize that what I think might work might actually undermine the very purposes I think that whatever policy I would support would try to achieve. I suppose if I were to spend my whole day, doing nothing but studying healthcare, I might have a few words that some people might, that might actually be helpful. But then again, at Countryside Community Church, there are over 200 people in our own congregation who are directly or indirectly a part of the healthcare industry. So you are studying this all the time already, and you have way more medical training than I have from my Boy Scout merit badge in first aid. Right? So while I might be able to talk about God's dream and how we love our neighbor as ourselves and so forth, how we apply that in very specific situations, we really need to hear from those who are on the front lines, those who are living, breathing, eating, sleeping these issues every day. They are aware of the consequences of these proposals far better than the average person, both their consequences that are intentional and unintentional. They know their effects. That's why I don't speak about healthcare. Or we did a series last summer on the book of Amos. You remember that series, The Prophetically Incorrect? A series in which we studied the 9th century and all that has amazing implications for today. But did you hear one proposal from this chancel about what economic policy we should adopt or who you should vote for? No, for the same reason. Now, I was an economics major in college. But one of the things I learned from being an economics major is that a little bit of knowledge of economics is dangerous. and that preachers are generally really bad economists. Right? And so us trying to make economic policy is really a fallacy. No, in the last, now here I'll use that word, 500 years, the context of ministry has shifted, and the church is only recently getting caught up with that fact. 500 years ago, Martin Luther stood up in the pulpit and proclaimed the priesthood of all believers, meaning it's not about who wears the robes, it's about who lives the life. But it's taken us 500 years, actually, to figure out that what that really means is that our lay people are truly on the front lines of ministry in this world. They are on the front line. You are on the front lines of the inbreaking of God's realm on earth. You are truly serving as ministers in the world, whether you are aware of it or not, or being called into that particular role. So what's my role then if I can't tell you how to vote on health care or economic policy or what politician or what have you? I mean, why bother showing up at church at all? Actually, some of you have asked me that question. Well, I'll tell you why, or at least give you my opinion about why. It's because at Countryside Church, both on Sunday mornings and throughout the week, we are focused on one question and one question only. And that is God living within your dream, or are you living within God's dream? How you answer that question determines a great deal about how happy you will be in this life, about how satisfied you will be in this life, and how you will approach struggle and overcome it in this life. If God is simply a subset within your dream, you're the dreamer and God's just a piece of that, then God's activity in your life is limited to the limits of your imagination, your knowledge, your view of what's acceptable. God is playing on a playing field, the boundaries of which you define, the timetable you determine, and the rules that you dictate. Oh, and God's always playing on your side, huh? Right? That's what happens when God lives within our dream. But when we live within God's dream, well, let's just say the borders of that playing field get awfully big, awfully wide. And God is free to act as God in our life rather than just simply our little support group. God is free to interact with you in ways that would, quite frankly, stun you, me, and all the rest of us. Come at us from angles that we could never predict, but truly enliven us because it comes from outside of our box. So, Jesus stands from Nazareth articulating, showing us how this works. They ask him to preach for them. He's going to then stand up, and what does he do? He starts articulating his understanding of God's dream for the world. God's dream is about preaching good news to the poor. Good news, not bad news. God's dream is about freeing the captive. You can imagine all the ways that we human beings become captive. It's about freeing the captive. It's about giving sight to the blind. And it's about letting the oppressed break free of their chains. And the people's reaction, what is it? First they're really impressed. Boy, he's got a lot of chutzpah to articulate such a grand vision. And they're impressed until Jesus actually lets on that he's expecting them to do something about this dream, not just give lip service to it. He actually expects them to live this dream, not simply do whatever they want and expect God to come along for the ride. And that provokes them to bring him to a cliff. They want to throw him over that cliff. On the one hand, that seems a little bit unfair, doesn't it? I mean, I've just admitted to you that as a Christian minister, I can't tell you precisely what is the policy that will fix health care. Yet Jesus says we need to go give sight to the blind, free the captive, preach good news to the poor. There's a billion policies around all those things, right? So, isn't it a bit unrealistic that he would ask us to live into God's dream when, not even a Christian minister can tell you the specifics about how to implement that dream? We don't live God's dream by trying to do everything that God dreams for this world, trying to do it all ourselves. The way we live God's dream, actually, is to first set aside what the needs of the world are, even what we think God's needs are, and simply ask one question: what brings you fully alive in this world? What ignites you? What ignites your passion and compassion? What gives you so much wholeheartedness and energy that you can do this day in, day out, that you would gladly do this? What form of work, whether it be through your vocation or through your avocation, that you could do that's not simply a paycheck for you, that's not simply a way of being recognized in the community for you, but is literally a way you channel this love that flows into you, through you, into the world. You ever notice how when you're wholeheartedly engaged with that sense of sweet spot in your life, that you can work really, really, really hard and it's like you've done no work at all? And yet if you're doing something that's outside of what your soul considers important, if you're simply trying to work for someone else and there's no connection to your soul's work, you can do a tenth that amount of work and your dream is simply, how do you do less work? No, your task is to find your sweet spot, your sense of aliveness, and trust that if God is the creator of your soul, and therefore God is intrinsically connected to you, that which ignites your soul is your call on this planet. That is what God is asking you to do, whether you realize the wider implications of it or not. So we find our sweet spot. And there's one more piece to that equation. This last summer, you heard me retell a story that I promised I would continue to retell to you until everybody in the congregation knows exactly what I mean when I invoke the word Simba's Automotive or Simba's Way. How many of you know what I mean when I say Simba's Automotive? Okay, not enough, so I'm going to retell the story. When I was a child growing up in Mercer Island, Washington, there was an automotive repair shop called Simba's Automotive. And this place was so special that when they treated your car with the utmost respect and integrity, they fixed it right the first time, honestly, never repairing something that didn't need to be repaired. It was perfection in action, poetry in motion, and they also treated you as the owner of that vehicle with such high respect and care that you almost wanted your car to be sick just to experience the Simba's way. And before I preached gave that story in the summer, I actually did a little research. I asked myself, is Simba still going? And I got on the web and found them. They move a few miles away. But I read Yelp reviews on Simba, people, just average users, reviewing them, all 5 stars, and they're continuing to rave about Simba's. One user even said, I brought my car into the shop to fix one thing, I picked it up, and they fixed another thing as well and didn't charge me for it. They said, it just needed to be done. That's the Simba's way. Well, years ago, a friend of mine asked one of the 2 brothers who own Simba's, what is it that makes you guys tick? And the one responded, well, my brother and I are Muslim, and we treat every car as if Muhammad himself were to drive away in it. That's ministry. You find that which brings you alive, which creates passion, ignites passion within you and compassion. And you treat the recipients of your labor as if they are Jesus Christ himself, and that is Christian ministry. Our lay people, you are on the front lines of the inbreaking of God's realm on earth. When you find that passion and you begin to treat people with that kind of love and care and respect, you are living out and enabling God's dream. In that same service this last summer, I announced a rather audacious goal. I said that in 5 years, I proposed we set a goal in 5 years that we have 200 ministers at Countryside Community Church. Not ordained ministers of word and sacrament like Chris and I are, but commissioned ministers. And commissioned ministers in the area of their sweet spot. So that if you are a auto mechanic or you are a pediatric cardiologist, if that is your sweet spot, that we take that seriously as a church. That we consider we actually have a ministry in auto mechanics or pediatric cardiology or grandparenting, if that's what's really tripping your trigger and rising your passion these days. Whatever it is, that we consider Countryside Church has a ministry in that, and consequently, we will come alongside you to help you reflect theologically on your area of interest. And so, and then we'll invite you to come alongside us and help us reflect on what does it mean that Countryside Church has a ministry in these areas, if only through you. What does it really mean? So that pediatric cardiologist, for instance, in ministry, seeing their vocation, their sweet spot is ministry, will then begin to ask, for instance, they'll start, likely a pediatric cardiologist is already treating their patients with care, great deal of care and respect. So that's not going to change. But what does change when you start seeing that person literally as Jesus himself? Instantly, Jesus invited us to do that, didn't he? He said, whatsoever you do to even the least of these, my people, you do to me. So we're to take that seriously. What happens when you see that person literally as Jesus? Well, first of all, if a cardiac patient came in, if it was Jesus, would you say, here's the person with the cardiac problem? No, you'd say, you wouldn't be defining that person according to their disease, would you? This is Jesus. Jesus is not defined by his disease. This is Jesus who happens to have a cardiac issue. So you start seeing this person as a whole person, not simply from the context of their disease. And if this is Jesus walking in to your office, you might also be asking, not simply concerned about the quality of care that you are giving this person, but you might be asking, well, how about his experience throughout this hospital? Is he being served as best as we can, if this is Jesus, in this hospital? And that person might also be asking, well, what about this healthcare system? If Jesus were a child with a cardiac problem, would the healthcare system that he's in presently serve him best, or is there any change we can make? And because you are involved in the real day-to-day issues of medicine, you know far better than the rest of us what changes are realistic and doable and what aren't. So you are on the cutting edge, the inbreaking of God's realm in your area. Well, when I kind of announced that audacious plan, I have a confession to make. I had no idea how we would actually bring that about. So it was helpful to say 5 years from now, right? I don't know how we're going to... Well, actually, I did have a few ideas. In fact, I had a lot of ideas of how we'd bring it about, but I had no idea how we could staff such a thing. Chris and myself, our plates are kind of full. And a program that deep would really take a high degree of intentionality and care for that program, especially to treat you like we would treat Jesus going through this program. And likely there'd be a whole lot of other people in our congregation who might not have an interest in going the commission ministry path, but might just want to relate their faith to their everyday lives more deeply through what's being done. So this program could get kind of large. Well, funny thing about trying to live within God's dream rather than just simply make God live within yours, you pretty much have to pay attention to those impulses, those intuitions that lead you in a direction, whether or not you can envision how it's supposed to come about or not. You just trust that following God's dream is enough, and God's at work providing the rest. Well, it just so happens there was a little seminary called Bangor Theological Seminary in Bangor, Maine. UCC Seminary has been around for 200 years. But as many of you know, seminaries themselves have had to go through a lot of rocking waters in the last decades, a lot of shifts, and a lot of them have gone under. And the whole context of ministry is changing. It's no longer about seminaries training ministers to go to the congregations to be ministry. Really, that's shifted. Now the congregations are more like seminaries who train their people to do ministry. So the seminaries are kind of hanging like, whoa, what do we do? So some of them have had to shift, and some of them haven't been able to make that shift. And after 200 years, Bangor Seminary decided it needed to close its doors as a functional seminary. But just because they ceased operation, they did not cease dreaming God's dream. So they continued to ask themselves, how can we continue to serve this country through creating ministry in this country? Well, they heard about this kind of audacious vision about actually commissioning lay people as ministers on behalf of churches, and how lay people are the front lines of ministry. And they said, that corresponds quite precisely to our understanding of what needs to be done, of really taking the priesthood of all believers seriously. And so they approached us this summer asking, is there any way we could help with that? Which then provoked a discussion on church council. And we came back from saying, actually, as a matter of fact, we could think of a couple ways you could help with that. And so one thing led to another, and I know that my punchline is already blown for some of you because you've been reading C10, or you've been hearing from the 660-66 group, or you saw it in your bullet. But what we proposed, and just act like you're excited if you've already heard this, but no, what we proposed was that we embark on a 5-year partnership in which the BTS Center, as they're now known, gives us funding to bring a minister to serve us full-time, and a specific minister whose specialty for 40 years of ministry has been helping people find their sweet spot and then relate it to their area of interest, namely somebody many of you know, Bruce Van Blair, who served at Countryside Church for 10 months before Chris came. That they provide 5 years of funding that will allow us to bring Bruce here to develop a fully fledged program in our sweet spot. And they said, okay. So now just because I have articulated this, I think this is where God's dream is taking us. And just because the church council has agreed with that does not mean that this is just simply a done thing. We are a congregational church, and so we take that seriously as well. You are on the front lines of ministry. You are on the front lines of discerning what God's will is for our congregation. Consequently, on Reformation Sunday, that's just a few Sundays from now, on the 27th, we invite you to stick around after worship, and we'll hear the whole proposal and have a chance to vote on that as a congregation to indicate whether we feel this is part of God's dream for us or not. And if you'd like to stick around after worship this morning for a few minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes, I'll be happy to develop this a bit more fully. But bottom line, when you start to allow God to move out from being just a subset of your dream to living into God's dream, God is able to do surprising things in anyone's life, to astonish us with the creative possibilities in our life, whether that be in our vocational lives or our household lives or just simply the heart-of-heart personal lives. When we link our souls where it wants to be linked into God's vision, the unexpected becomes what you can expect.